Hello, welcome to HIST 141, U.S. History since 1877. And this lecture is entitled American Modern Cultural Ties 1880 to 1917. And this path is going to talk about culture in a broad sense in the United States in the late 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries up to World War One. And I mean that both in terms of art and stuff like that, but also just changing social more. It's all culture means your habits of a society in a few important areas, but also its encounter with modernity. And I titled it American Modern, thinking of art, and I'm having you guys read some stuff or look at some stuff, look at some artwork from the period. And I wanted to step back in going into this lecture, and because we've gone through the meat of what you probably understand history to be, politics and other stuff that was not as interesting, maybe the economic stuff, the industrialization, urbanization, all the isations we can think of, Western settlement and so forth. I did want to touch on cultural history and talk about some of the things that are going on with art and literature, but also just changes in the way people conceive of themselves and the way they view things like family life. So we'll get into this here, right here. And I'm thinking, of course, of World War One, because World War One is in some ways the first modern war, with all the sort of technology, tanks, chemical weapons, flamethrowers get invented in this war. A lot of the stuff that comes out of it's modernizing. And those are the sorts of things what I'm thinking of there. And but there's also ideas at play. Even before World War One, we know how devastating it was to Europe. But there were people in Europe who welcomed World War One. There was a group of thinkers that called themselves futurists, who favored the war. Why? Because they thought it would destroy the old order in Europe. The name's pretty self-explanatory. And what I'm talking about here is, modernity as a sort of self-conscious embrace of things that are new. Because of course, America is a modern nation anyway, right? Our revolution that birthed the country was sort of the first modern revolution in a way. If you made a break from the past, that's what modern means, basically, in its most basic sense. The word term modern means the latest thing, the newest thing. Modernity is something else, I think. Modernity means, a self-conscious embrace of breaking with the past, a self-conscious embrace that the past was worse or the future is going to be better, of destruction for its own sake, like those people called futurists who welcomed the war. And I say this because these ideas of modernity are already there before World War One. This is the thing to talk about here. But of course, America gets there to they come to America in a different setting than they do for Europe because of the war. The war, of course, in Europe is, as we'll see, we'll get into next time, post-war era in Europe, is really a time of despair in some degree because the war destroyed so much. World War One is the beginning of the end, in some ways, of European sense of identity. They had to sort of remake it after World War Two. Whereas World War One confirms America's identity for America. It's such a good thing. We helped win the war. We're responsible for that stuff. And so in our minds, so they don't enter that post-war era without that sense of cultural despair. But as I said before, there are already ideas in the air, trends in the air that will feed into the post-war period, interwar period, then the post-war period of the 1950s. Stemming from stuff you guys have already studied so far: industrialization, which has an effect on social life, urbanization has a huge effect on social life, and other things play in this. But also you'll see some more specifically newer ideas emerging self-consciously that embrace modernity, which will affect American life going forward. The first thing to talk about here is the change in family life, changing gender roles at the end of the 19th century. Your textbook emphasizes this. I won't go over it too much here. The the ideals for most of American, European life in the 19th century, which you might call Victorian, after Queen Victoria of England, she lived most of the 19th century, called for, a sort of, you know, prim and proper sense of gender roles. Men should be restrain their appetites and desires. Um, Women would have moral influence in the home, but not outside of it. But industrialization changes all of this. More and more women at the end of the 19th century are exerting influence outside the family through involvement in reform movements and things of this nature, although they were doing that before in the United States. If you go back to the abolitionist movement, a lot of the most prominent abolitionists were women in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. And things begin to change with the family, especially in the middle class in the post-Civil War decades. There was a long decline in the birth rate, which actually begins in the late 18th century, but sort of accelerates at the end of the period here. In 1800s, white men anyway, who survived to middle age, had an average of seven children. By 1900, the average was 3.6 children. And so there's a big shift here. Several things did this. I mean, Americans were marrying at older ages. Many mothers, were spacing out births, spacing out pregnancies. By the late 19th century, people also began to have access to a range of artificial contraceptive methods, condoms, diaphragms, even though they rarely mention these in sources. It's considered to be a taboo subject. But this has an effect on things. And at the end of the 19th century, there was something of I don't say a moral panic about this, but there was a concern about this. In the 1870s, Anthony Comstock, who was the secretary of the Society for the Suppression of Vice, you've already met this actually when we talked about activism, secured the passage of a federal law that banned obscene materials from the US mail. And the law prohibited circulation of almost any information about sexual activity and birth control. And so you have this sort of, again, the sense of this being a taboo subject. So people, again, when they grew to adulthood, had different choices to make in this era, but it was something people noticed at the time. But again, as I mentioned before, you do have this transition, this ideal of women having their place in the home, of being the center of domesticity for their families. It basically commands widespread adherence for most women for most of this period. Again, but you're also going to have changes in the way this comes about. Modern consumer culture with advertising and the sale of sort of goods. From this emerges one particular public space that is designed for women, that's the department store. In earlier generations, men had largely controlled the pocketbook. Men did the shopping, actually, in earlier eras. Women's task in an earlier era was to work at home to produce families' food and clothing. They would make the clothing. By, of course, late 19th century, people don't live on farms anymore. People live in towns and cities. Women become the main shoppers. And so it attracted, women by offering things like tea rooms, child's play areas, stuff that's, still exists actually, to cater to them. You also had women getting more and more into reform. Middle class women are constantly active, actually, in many types of reform, from patriotic type stuff to more political things. Women's clubs sprang up all over the place. In fact, there was actually in 1890, there was a creation of a nationwide General Federation of Women's Clubs. And these clubs frequently made this argument, frequently made what are called maternalist arguments for their engagement in civic life, which is that they were based on what they thought of as women's special talents. Women had a special role to play in public life because of their maternal instincts, right? And I've already mentioned this, I won't go back to it too much, but one of the first areas they did this in was the temperance movement. That was very much an activism, a part of their activism. Another movement, of course, that came about, well before the Civil War takes off in the late 19th century, is the suffrage movement. And so you're going to have lots of activism. And from out of this, you're going to have, by the early 20th century, a few women going beyond the sort of, well, okay, because of women's special role as caregivers and mothers, they have some role outside the home. You're going to have a few, not very many, intellectuals rebel against that ideal itself. And this takes place in New York City, New York's Greenwich Village, where you had a community of radical intellectual types in the 1910s. Some women there in 1912 founded the so-called Heterodoxy Club, which was open to any woman who pledged not to be, quote, orthodox in her opinions, unquote. Again, this is an instance of modernity, right? The idea that what is normal, what is the norm, what is, conventional opinion is obviously wrong. This is a good example of it. So you have intellectuals, journalists, labor organizers. And again, you had the first people calling themselves feminists in the late 19th century and articulating, goals that go beyond, even getting the right to vote. That they should work outside the home, but their role in life was not to be mothers primarily, those sorts of things. Again, that's a tiny minority. Most women, again, engage the public world through associations outside the home, like temperance movement, but particularly through religious organizations. A lot of them worked in missionary activities. Missions have been had been a prominent fact of American life since the 1820s at the latest, sending missions overseas to go to different places across the world, helping out in, offering things like medical services abroad. And by 1915, some 3 million women participated in these different types of missionary societies. And so they're active through in that regard. And this is one of the great ages of Protestant missionary work in America. So it's kind of goes with the territory. Even though there's these modern ideas, self-conscious modern ideas, beginning to take root in certain places. This is a little picture here. If you can see, this is one of these. This is a temperance pledge. It has a date on it, but late 19th century, getting people to pledge to abstain from drink, believing it to be better for all, et cetera, et cetera. We understand with the help of God to abstain from the use of all intoxicating drinks as a beverage. Again, so you have that, the ideal of domesticity, the family together, and all that stuff. It's right there. One other type of activism, this is a particular person. This is Ida B. Wells. It was an African-American woman who wrote exposés about lynching in the South during the late 19th century. See, this is 1892. And so women did get, again, involved in things outside the more traditional sphere, but she was prominent for exposing this was the worst era, by the way, for things like lynching in the South, this period up through the First World War, its heyday. You also have changing roles in terms of changing ideals of gender roles with men to a certain degree. And men's gender roles have always been kind of constant to a certain degree, but there's a change because by the 1900 or so, remember, there has been this shift where in the middle classes, we should think about this as class-based, because in 1900, again, a successful man in the middle classes in 1800 worked for himself. He was economically independent. He was his own boss. By 1900, men worked for other people. They weren't their own bosses. They worked for salaries. And an increasing number did, office work, brain work, no longer used their muscle, right? So this was seen to be by some people to be a threat to manhood. And so athletics became a way for men to prevent weakness and maintain their toughness and strength in an organized way for the first time. This begins as early as the 1850s with the founding of the YMCA, which you don't know what that actually means. They've actually officially shortened their name. They can call themselves YMCA. They call themselves the Y now because they want to get away from their origins, but it was a Christian organization, Young Men's Christian Association. um, founded in Boston in 1851, combined, sort of evangelizing with sports, with activities, and they actually had local businesses, establish teams to instill competitive spirit, all that stuff. This is why big corporations have like company softball teams and stuff like this, right? So um, YMCA, to its credit, also offered working class men, the opportunity for leisure, for indoor games of basketball and volleyball and stuff like that. And so you'll have this, attraction, and it does, by the way, this mania for sports, and the term muscular Christianity goes into this as well. Also gets the elites. The elites play different sports. Sometimes they'll actually get into more aggressive sports, elite men, boxing, weightlifting, martial arts, stuff like that. But you also have in this period the rise of modern sports leagues. Before the Civil War, there were no distinctively American games except for lacrosse, which was a Native American game. And Americans of European descent preferred to play cricket. However, before the before the Civil War, you began to have rules for a new team sport called baseball, developed in the 1840s and 50s, and it spread in military camps during the Civil War. In the post-war era, it became the most popular sport in America. And it was developed by independent craftsman types, middle-class types, to prove strength and fitness. But again, this is a theme here. Employers encourage working class men to participate in things like this because it promoted supposedly discipline and teamwork. The idea to get you to work harder, do more work for us. And it begins with the founding of the National League in 1876. Later on, the American League will be founded, obviously. During the first World Series in 1903, the Boston Americans defeated the Pittsburgh Pirates. And you have these teams being, created out of this. There is, of course, by the early 1900s, initially there had been, I should mention this, a few African Americans who played in some of these leagues. By the early 1900s, it's pretty much segregated. And so they begin to turn, Black players created their own league, the Negro Leagues, as an alternative. The most controversial sport that emerged in the late 19th century was actually football, and it began at Ivy League schools in the 1880s. And by the way, it was controversial because it was so brutal. People play without helmets and stuff like that, and people are killing each other. And in fact, Theodore Roosevelt was actually stepped in to try to make rule. I can't remember his exact role off the top of my head, but he played a role in sort of saving the sport from being, people thought it was too dangerous, which of course things have come back again, right? People are worried about CTE, which is a real concern these days, but controversial for that reason. But it soon found business sponsorships. The first professional teams will emerge around the turn of the century in Western Pennsylvania, steel towns, Pittsburgh, and executives of Carnegie Steel organized teams in Homestead and Braddock. And the first league actually appeared during a coal strike in 1902. So this isn't just doing it for money or sports sake. It's definitely related to big business. And then finally, the great outdoors becomes a sort of site of not just masculine, but a lot of men, like manly sorts of sports and stuff, going into the outdoors, roughing it, that sort of thing. This is the same time that you had the creation of the American park system. And so you had the foundation of, organizations like the Appalachian Mountain Club in 1876, the Sierra Club in 1892, which were dedicated to preserving and enjoying America's great, parks and its, natural scenery. And so this is also sort of part of this as well. Hiking, going into the great outdoors, this becomes a means of sort of again proving your masculine wares. Again, you have the creation of the Boy Scouts at the end of this era as well. Those sorts of things all kind of go together with this idea of changing, or changing role, needing to sort of reestablish masculinity in the face of these modern changes to work. Here you can see this is Frank Merriwell's Chums. This is number 2. I don't have a date on this anywhere here if I can see this. This is doesn't say, but this is of course a baseball magazine. You can kind of see this here. Ideal publication for the American youth, trying to teach them athletics. And here is a football practice at an Indian school in 1911. So to give you an idea again why this was dangerous, they're not wearing helmets. So yeah, that's part of the reason why it was controversial for a while. Then finally, lastly, you have consumer spaces, which is already kind of mentioned, are gendered spaces. Consumer-oriented businesses they've changed people's habits this way. Department stores for women become a site of this technique. But you also have spaces segregating people to a certain degree by class. Consumer culture is supposed to be democratic, so that's the way it's sold in advertising, but really technology widens the gap between the classes. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, telephones, they eased life for the middle classes. They didn't necessarily do that if you couldn't afford them, although they could offer employment opportunities for the working class. But in other places, they were literally segregated. Big one, of course, is like railroad companies. They appeal to middle-class consumers, offering amenities, rail cars, but only if you paid for it. So first class, right? You're second class if you're working class. Also, of course, and this is going along with something we've already talked about in a more political sense, it also leads to segregation of the races. Again, first class rail cars are, even if you have the money, are off limits to African Americans. The doctrine of separate but equal was instantiated by Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case in 1896. And so in reality, and by the way, in reality, these segregated facilities were never equal, they were inferior. And so you have in the South, all public and commercial spaces in the South are segregated by race. So again, not exactly necessarily a good thing in that regard, obviously. Again, a picture in advertisement from 1893, pitching advertisements. You can see, again, advertising is a big thing. It creates markets. It creates desire for goods and services. This is what a department store looks like from 1910. Not that different when you think about it. It's amazing how little things have changed in 112 years. Not that different, of course. Pitched to the ladies. So that's one way of things changing. I'm going to talk about here about the changing world of education a little bit in late 19th, early 20th century. And for people who wanted to get into the middle class, and this has been something since then, education is the watchword, right? Hey, I guess it is the day, right? That's why you're here, community college, taking this course. But if you want to, secure respectability, a good job, you go through education. And the rise of the American high school begins in the late 19th century, when there's this push to make more years of schooling compulsory for more people. And high school education was particularly valuable for boys from affluent families who hoped to enter professional managerial work. It's only in this period that it first becomes compulsory in many places. It had not been so. Most people worked on farms before this, obviously. But also in this age, it was not for anybody anyway. A lot of these high schools they didn't take anybody. You had to take these exams to get into them. You can find some of these, by the way, floating around on the internet, like entrance exams into a high school. And they're really ridiculously difficult, actually. I had to try to take one of them one time. It didn't go well. You had to know a lot to get into these high schools. But if you could, they were free and open to everybody. And in fact, some schooling, most people stopped going to school for, if they worked on the farm for reasons they had to go to work, what would be middle school for us. But more and more people are going. By 1900, 1 out of every 100 Americans, basically 7 out of every 10 Americans between the ages of 5 and 18 attended some sort of schooling. And part of this, I should mention, part of this was a result of urbanization, the need to train a workforce in an industrial society, and also the felt need to assimilate immigrants. We'll come back to this in a second, because again, part of this and part of your schooling, you went through this. You have to be at school all day long. You have to sit in a classroom. You have to sit still. All this stuff. This model of schooling comes ultimately from Prussia, Germany. And part of the reason for this was not just to teach people subjects, it was to instill discipline in kids. It was to make them docile and obedient. So this is, in this case for the workforce that's needing to emerge in a new industrial society, but also, of course, for immigrants. There, of course, was a big nativist movement in the United States, late 19th century. So you have laws being passed to make things like, education being, compulsory. It's partly because of this, partly because there were these fears that immigrants wouldn't assimilate. There was a lot of fear, especially about Catholic immigrants, for example. The reason being the Catholic Church has its own system of schools, parochial schools. By 1920, almost 2 million children in the United States attended Catholic elementary schools instead of public schools. Catholic dioceses across the country operated over 1,500 high schools by then. And so there were attempts, and this gets into the later period a little bit, there were attempts by states to ban private education. And I say private education, they were clearly aimed at Catholics. They were favored by nativist groups. But in a famous Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court in 1922, Pierce versus the Society of Sisters, struck this down and said that Catholic parochial schools were okay. But there was this sense they didn't want people outside of the public school system because it was meant to, again, assimilate them. Most high schools were co-ed. Their curriculum included literature, composition, history, geography, biology, mathematics, etc., etc. As again, I mentioned before, these could be very rigorous. And in fact, by the time you get to the early 20th century, the American high school system is not what it used to be. It was sort of the envy of the world at that point, because it was a real entryway into going to college. It was a lot more difficult. But this is a huge change. And I mentioned, I'm emphasizing education here. You have to understand something. When you have a change in in education, especially higher education, in terms of its ideals, its curricula, its founding principles, it's definitely a sign there's a social change going on. Because education is important to whatever regime happens to be in power, and whatever government, whatever time and place. And there were also this is mostly especially true in higher education, which expands by the 1920s. But most of the 19th century, the percentage of Americans who attended college hovered around 2%, very, very elite. Driven by the expansion of public universities, this percentage will rise in the 1880s to reach 8% by 1920. I want to say it's something like 42% today. People who attend some sort of higher education. That's the change. That's how much more or less exclusive it is today. You also had other efforts to make education available to people. One of the most famous of which was Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, founded in 1881, which again was a more sort of vocational institute. And you also had different types of colleges being created in this era. In the Northeast and the South, women most often attended same-sex institutions with teacher training colleges, where the student body was all female or overwhelmingly female. You also had private colleges. You have private colleges for women, the so-called Seven Sisters, Vassar College, Smith, Wellesley, and others being founded. Co-education in higher education was much more prevalent in the Midwest and the West, where you have state universities opening their doors to female students after the Civil War. Women were also admitted to most of the Southern African American colleges founded during the Reconstruction. And one of the big things that impacts this are the founding of land grant colleges in the late 19th century, states giving grants of land for, that's what it literally means, to start state universities. And you'll have, especially in fact, this is big in the Midwest, especially, for a variety of reasons. So a lot more people are going through the institution of education. A lot more people are being exposed to ideas that are filtering down to these educational institutions, into them. The other thing that happens, this is a little more, we're getting into intellectual history here. I won't beat you over the head with it. But one of the things that's going to happen is that the academic world itself is going to be secularized in the 19th century. Part of what's going on here is that before the late 19th century, pretty much all institutions of higher education had been effectively Christian of some sort or another. They'd all been, rooted in particular denominations, Protestant denominations. You'd have some Catholic schools, Catholic colleges. But even more than that, the curricula was different, because it was basically a largely humanistic, religiously oriented education, where you would have to know the main purpose was not learning skills per se that would get you a job or make you technically proficient in something. You could, of course, do law and medicine and things like that, but the core of the education was essentially humanist, to master a body of knowledge, both classical, ancient Greek. These older schools, you had to learn Greek and Latin, and biblical knowledge, stuff that was taken to be necessary stuff you need to know in order to be considered an educated person. And all these institutions were thoroughly, when I say the religious, even state-run institutions in the 19th century might begin classes with the Lord's Prayer. They were doing this, I know, in state schools into the 20th century, if I'm not mistaken. While religion, in some form or another, was always part of the curriculum. In private institutions like Harvard began as a Congregationalist, the Congregationalist Church in Massachusetts. As part of that body, chapel was mandatory. And to this day, the great universities of the East Coast all have schools of divinity, which again goes back to their origins as something other than a secular research institution. These institutions were originally formed for training clergy, and the clergy were kind of the old intellectual class in the early republic. And what's going to happen, of course, is that the curricula they all shared, which is effectively a Protestant and sort of common sense ideas about the world that lay behind it, are unified by this idea that all knowledge was sort of guaranteed by God. That's why theology was, the queen of the sciences or whatever. And what's happening is all this is getting replaced in the late 19th century. And it's getting replaced because, of course, people know that because of industrialization, things like this are changing. And the United States is going to start imitating German models of the university that come from Germany ultimately, and from Europe. And I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but they have a very different idea of what constitutes a curricula. Mainly, it's essentially, I wouldn't even call it necessarily a secular idea, but it's definitely one that departs from the earlier ones. German reformers, especially one named Wilhelm von Humboldt, in the early part of the 19th century, held up an idea which they called Wissenschaft, which means knowledge as a unified whole, in which, first of all, the individual finds his place and goes through growth and self-discovery, but also that it pursues knowledge in a way that's rigorous in the arts and humanities, just as rigorous as it is rigorously in the arts and humanities as it is in the natural sciences. This is an idea, they actually use a term for this, that everything should be pursued as a quote unquote rigorous science, and that all knowledge can be unified by such scientific precision. I mention this because this is definitely meant as a replacement for the idea that, well, theology is what unites all knowledge into a whole. And this is, again, it's kind of peculiar. It's almost kind of quasi-religious itself, because it takes a sort of religious belief to believe you can do this. But the point is, upshot of this is that the United States, educators in the late 19th century, people like Charles Eliot, who's an educator at Harvard, self-consciously import these ideas. And the big thing, what happens is that in this curricula, you're going to have different variations on it, is that the idea is that in this model, what you have with the earlier model is like you're receiving knowledge from the ancient world, from the Bible, from this, and you learn to, master that body of knowledge and sort of pass it on. The idea is very different here. The idea here is that you are searching for knowledge. You are discovering knowledge for yourself, or even creating it. It's not something you receive from the past. Which is why the German model, the Germans, if you don't know, invented the whole idea of a doctoral degree. There were no doctoral degrees. It was invented by them. And their ideal was someone who combined research in their field, no matter what it would be, literature or history or whatever else, with teaching. That's the model that still exists today in the United States. Whereas before, it was mostly all you would do was teach and you learn, but there's no research involved. And what happens is over time, this is going to, lead the emergence of new ideals of knowledge. Idea that, learning should be a matter of the critical faculties. You shouldn't just receive things from the past. You have to go criticize them. You will have, again, this very scientific ethos. That's the other thing, is the idea that, just giving you an example in practical terms what I'm talking about. You have this very sort of inductive scientific idea of how you you come by knowledge. The idea was everyone will be specialists in their own fields, whatever they are, biology, history, this or that. And the idea for these educators, I'm dumbing this down for the sake of time, but the idea is everyone will become experts in their little field. They contribute to their academic journals. Everybody would read everybody else's journals, right? So you're a biologist, you'll read stuff in history, and everybody will learn everyone else's research, and that's how you'll come to a sort of a unification of knowledge. Instead of it being unified by religious belief, it would be unified by this, primary research or whatever. They were looking for a new unity, a new way to unify knowledge. To give you an example of what I mean by scientific, this is where you get, new disciplines being created. For example, one that's created in the late 19th century is sociology, a science of human society. The idea that you're going to have a scientific take on human society, which, by the way, the first sociology course taught in the United States was taught in 1892 at the University of Kansas. And so this was the idea. As it turns out, by the way, this didn't work at all. What happened was, and what is still a huge problem no one's ever overcome today, is that instead of that happening, every discipline became so specialized that nobody can keep up with their own journals or own subspecialty within their own fields. And so it's kind of a clash. It's kind of a sort of cacophony of noise instead of unifying knowledge. But it did create the modern sort of the modern university and the modern idea of knowledge being based on this, this, you call it scientism, the idea that real knowledge has to be sort of rigorous in the same way that the natural sciences are. Sorry if it's not too clear. That's basically what happens. And so in the tides of culture, I'm going to go through a few things here, just to overview, not to waste too much of your time, but one of which we have to talk about, I mentioned already in terms of educational institutions, just the influence of modern science. People by the late 19th century, and the United States, this is, and most countries still are late 19th century. The United States is a deeply religious country. It's a self-consciously evangelical Protestant country. People would mostly describe themselves as that if they were Protestants at that period. But late 19th century saw a almost literal belief in science, like faith in science. Researchers in many fields became converts to what your textbook calls fact worship, or worship of fact. The belief that only hard facts and observable phenomena are true. And this gets not just into the sciences, but into fiction and artists, and we'll get to this in a moment. And you could also, another term for this, by the way, could be positivism. This is the idea if you pile up enough facts about something, you'll get to sort of, truth this way. And it really has an influence on a lot of things. And the most important, of course, idea that goes from its, very specialized meaning in a body of natural science to the general world in the 19th century is, of course, the theory of evolution associated with Charles Darwin. You probably know the story. He writes his On the Origin of Species in 1859, which proposed the theory of natural selection. In nature, all creatures struggle to survive. Individual members who have traits that are advantageous for their particular environment survive and pass on those traits. Again, I should mention by the late 19th century, there's still actually some disagreements about this among scientists. It doesn't really get settled in the middle of the 20th century, but in its popular form, it becomes a very powerful influence. And in particular, not even so much the actual idea, but the implications of it. Putative, I should say, implications of it. The idea that life is always changing, and that conversely, everything that is static is dead by definition, and only the strong survive. It exerts an overwhelming influence in a lot of people's minds, and nothing and no one is really untouched by its influence. And in fact, it's going to get into one of the more brutal misapplications of this idea to modern human society, which is the idea of eugenics, a science of human breeding. Eugenicists wanted to improve the human race. They wanted to improve it. Again, the idea of evolution is, change for the better. And this idea of evolution, I should mention this, sort of gets, mixed up with the idea of social progress in the 19th century. They'll get separated by World War II, among other things, 2 world wars, I should say, among other things. But this idea that they kind of go together, and the idea is that you improve the traits of the race, but you do this partly by improving the population, but you do that by getting rid of the unfit, by sterilizing people who don't have good traits. And in fact, there were eugenicists agitated for laws in the United States that called for the forced sterilization of residents of asylums or for the mentally disabled. And in fact, by the early 20th century, almost half of the United States enacted eugenics laws. By the time eugenics began to subside in the 1930s, some 20,000 people had been sterilized. So this is, I should mention, by the way, eugenicists also supported segregation, racial segregation, and advocated immigrant restrictions for that same reason. They also, by the way, this is also something I mentioned here, they also supported things like birth control. Part of their justification for it was to get rid of, to keep the unfit parts of the population from breeding. If you don't know, it's kind of a weird thing. It's a later period, but the British writer Eric Hugh Blair, who you probably know better as George Orwell, was a socialist and an atheist, but he was opposed to contraceptives, and the reason why is he thought it was sort of a plot to get rid of the working classes. And this is actually part of this. This is the last thing to note here, is that class has a lot to do with this, obviously. When Darwinism, social Darwinism, I should say, the application of Darwin's idea, gets into intellectual life, it'll find its champions. The person who comes up with social Darwinism, the main theorist, is a British philosopher, Herbert Spencer. In America, the biggest name associated with this was William Graham Sumner, a sociology professor, again, one of those modern disciplines I talked about, who saw competition as a law of nature, and that millionaires were successful. That's because they were naturally selected. And again, if you weren't, that means you were naturally selected to fail. And a lot of people criticized this, by the way. There were critics. People said this was just an excuse for the worst excesses of the Gilded Age, which it was. But it was a powerful idea. And just to give you an idea about eugenics, to see how, again, there's a lot of intellectual heft behind this. You can see this here. This is the eugenics tree. This came as sort of, I want to say this is a symbol of there are multiple eugenic societies. I know in Britain, but also in the United States. This may be a symbol in one of them, but you can see how you can see it, the appeal of this, okay, this appeal of science, right? Science will give us control over nature. Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. But look at all this, what it says down here, like a tree, eugenics draws its materials from many sources and organizes them into an harmonious entity. But look at all these disciplines, which, by the way, look at down here, they do actually include religion in this. It's a very weird sort of propaganda and kind of creepy, by the way. And by the way, if you don't notice, this is playing on a religious symbol. If you can remember the book of Genesis, the Bible, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of good and life. This is kind of what this is playing on. Weird stuff. Even more creepy is things like this. This is the New York Daily Tribune from Sunday, February 18, 1912. Eugenicists would improve human stock by blotting out blood taints. Menaces to society. Scientists are studying how to cut down the awful cost of mankind of bad heredity, which often swells from a tiny pool to a black ocean of mental defectiveness. If you're, wondering, again, to go back to this, we'll come back to this a little later, but people talked in these terms, really, obviously, very blatantly, terms of not just things like this, but in terms of race, fit and unfit races. Didn't just refer to black and white, it referred to just race in general, being fit or unfit. And if you're wondering, by the way, what ended all this, it was the Second World War, the Holocaust. But people talked like this. Eugenics was wildly popular, not just in the United States, but also in Germany before World War II. This, by the way, this is something, this is amazing stuff. You had these eugenic societies sponsor these so-called fitter family contests to, again, like, I guess somehow measurements of physical health or something. And this is a picture of this, the winners of the Fitter Family Contest from 1920 from Topeka, Kansas, of all places. But yeah, this went on for a couple of decades, this sort of thing. It's amazing. We'll come back to this in a minute because this does have some ideological components here as well, beyond just science. Other changes this goes along with, I mentioned changes in curricula in the universities. You have changes in history and philosophy, new ideas. A group of historians, which is referred to as the School of New History, emerges in America in the early 20th century. New for a couple of reasons. One is because it was interested in topics outside of politics, such as economics and the history of intellectual ideas. But also because it's new in the sense, again, you're having the emergence of these new history programs, these new PhD programs, which take a much more critical line toward the history of the country. So you have people like, and most of these people come from Columbia originally, Columbia University, Ivy League school. But to give one example, one famous example is that of Charles Beard, who was an historian who wrote economic histories. And he wrote a book in 1913, very influential, called An Economic Interpretation of the United States Constitution. And it effectively is informed by progressive ideas. Remember, the progressives were, they wanted to, corral big business and stuff like this. He was thinking of that. He was thinking of, the Carnegies and the big trusts and the rubber barons. But he sort of read that back into the U.S. Constitution. And his critique was that basically the U.S. Constitution was created by the wealthy upper class of the colonies who were trying to preserve their status and wealth. And then the Constitution reflected that. His colleague, who he wrote books with, James Harvey Robinson, was an intellectual historian, famously taught intellectual history. Nobody ever taught him intellectual history course before in the United States. And then finally, Carl Becker, who wrote about 18th century and the American Revolution, had ideas about this, which were very, again, kind of new. I mentioned him partly because he taught at the University of Kansas from 1902 to 1916. And Beard and Robinson, he wasn't, Becker wasn't, but Beard and Robinson were both associated with progressivism. So there's some crossover from that political theory there too. Another thing that emerges in this period is the only, as far as I'm aware, original school of philosophy that is American. A group of philosophers are calling themselves using the term pragmatism to refer to their ideas, emerged in the 1870s in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They actually formed a club, which they called the Metaphysical Club. They would give papers and read them to each other. Most important of these was Charles Peirce, a mathematician who started out at a university, but eventually lost his job and never got it back. So this emerges from the university system. But also William James, more famous as a psychologist and a philosopher. The other major figure was John Dewey, a student of both, or at least of, he's doing both of them actually. And Dewey was a philosopher, but also an educator. So he's important because these pragmatist ideas get into the educational system. And pragmatism taught that basically the principle of whether something is true or not is its usefulness, its practicality. Does it work? Does a policy, does an idea, does a proposal? But that's the criteria of their worth, not some transcendent ideal of truth, like in Platonism, if there's truth beyond our senses or something like this. Not anything like nature, like we don't follow nature. Only in what works. Action is more important than doctrine or ideas. Experience is more important than fixed principles. And the meanings of our ideas derive from their consequences and from how they get verified, not from their intrinsic value. And so ideas are essentially the instruments for action. And so this is a fairly, kind of relativistic sounding philosophy. And they are, by the way, influenced by evolutionary theory. And they emphasize the plastic, malleable nature of the world, of reality. And the function of knowledge is as an instrument for adapting and controlling it. You can easily see, by the way, how this feeds into and is kind of similar to, progressive ideas about politics, right? That the state is an instrument for controlling and remaking industrial society, making it more just. And all this kind of reflects, as I mentioned before, this change in history and philosophy, a shift in class terms, not, working class versus upper class, but a new upper class replacing an old one. And no one embodies this more than the historian, journalist, and sometimes diplomat, Henry Adams. Henry Adams was, he dies in 1917, or was it 1916? I had it in my notes, but I think it's 1916 he dies. But he was the great-grandson of John Adams, the second president, and the great-grandson of John Quincy Adams, who was also president in the 1820s. He came from a prestigious, very prestigious New England family, the Adams family. And he was someone who, despite being born into this very illustrious family, felt lost in the modern industrial age. He was someone who had that sort of classical humanist culture, that humanist education that I talked about earlier. He grew up in the 1830s. He did the grand tour, went to Europe when he was a young man, came back though, and went when he was 23 years old. He went to England to act. His father was an ambassador or a diplomat of some sort there for the United States. But came back, spent several years teaching medieval history at Harvard. He was brought there by Charles Eliot, the reformer, but also worked as a magazine editor, but also a very accomplished historian himself. He wrote several biographies of people like John Randolph, John Randolph was a cousin of Thomas Jefferson. I'm butchering all of this. And other figures. Wrote a multi-volume history of the United States during the Jeffersonian and Monroe administrations. But he was still saw himself as kind of obsolete. He loved the medieval period. He admired what he saw as the social, intellectual, spiritual unity of medieval Europe. There's a section in his memoirs, he publishes privately in 1906, but they're published after his death, called The Education of Henry Adams. It's become a bestseller, in which he talks about this, how he's and by the way, if you've ever read this, I've read parts of it, it's kind of funny because he talks about himself in the third person, but he thought, because there's a section in there called The Dynamo and the Virgin. The dynamo is kind of like a motor or a battery or an engine. And he's contrasting that with the image of the Virgin Mary that you get kind of in the Middle Ages, right? In art, in in big, grand cathedrals in Europe, which he loved. And he saw this older civilization represented by the Virgin as being more spiritual, being more, you know, elevated, all this other stuff. But he thought it was doomed by the technological advances in modern society. And he kind of saw himself in the same light. He's a guy who had accomplished all this stuff. He was very brilliant. He was very um, had a lot of self-doubt for a guy that accomplished that much. He was especially disparaging of the American political classes in his day. Again, he came from that old world. He hated the new elite. He hated the new industrialists. He had nothing but contempt for most politicians. He couldn't, the old, and this is what's happening. The old upper class that he represented is being, with its humanist education and old world outlook, is being replaced by industrialists and reformer types, and of course corrupt politicians who he despises. He he apparently, to make this point about how much he disliked them, he liked to repeat a remark that Ulysses S. Grant made, that, quote, Venice would be a fine city if it were drained. If you don't know, Venice is the famous city with canals, and like his idea is that Grant's such a friggin' know nothing that he's saying Venice and all its beauty should be drained. But this is his work is an enduring sort of legacy of this change. So it's very interesting to see him, a very thoughtful person, even in a weird way, talking about it. But it's kind of a shift to a more self-consciously modern society and a more self-consciously modern upper class. And I got the date wrong. It's 1906. I totally screwed up, but this is his own copy. That's his handwriting there. It was printed privately in 1906. And eventually gets published after his death. But you can, the Education of Henry Adams for plain there. And then in literature and the arts, a sort of self-conscious modernity emerges, in which literature becomes, well, there's a movement toward greater realism and naturalism in art. Realism is, that sounds what it sounds like, right? Trying to capture reality. Naturalism's the idea that you're capturing in art, painting is capturing the human form in its natural proportions. You're not trying to make it idealized. But in both senses of that term, capturing the natural world as it really is, rebelling against the sentimentality of Victorian culture and literary culture. And by the 1890s, a young generation of writers were doing this. People like the novelist and editor William Dean Howells, whose goal was to, quote, picture daily life in the most exact terms possible, unquote. People like Theodore Dreiser, the playwright, dismissed unrealistic novels that had happy endings, right? It's too Hollywood, right? Stephen Crane, who's one of these newer novelists, writes a book in 1883 called Maggie, a Girl in the Streets, which describes the seduction and abandonment and death of a slum girl, of a working class girl. And so you're getting, looking at the gritty realities of life, those sorts of things. Another person who was famous for his naturalism was Jack London. It's not his actual real name, it's a pseudonym, but it's Jack London, who spent his teenage years as a factory worker, a sailor, later on dramatized what he saw as the reality of an uncaring universe. And he was an atheist, and so he sort of echoes the ideas of social Darwinism in some of his writings. Other authors take a similar line. Ambrose Bierce, if you know who this is sometimes called Bitter Bierce because of his skeptical attitude toward things like religion. He's famous for a work called The Devil's Dictionary, in which he defines terms in a sort of skeptical way. There's also a turn toward here. One of the things that London and other people sort of catch on about is human beings not being rational agents anymore, that they're the subject of forces beyond their control, the natural world, but also increasingly their own subconscious impulses and desires. And there is a turn toward, in this realistic and natural writing, toward, turn to the subjectivity of the characters rather than telling a story with a plot and everything. Um, one of the most important instances of this, two important ones, is Stephen Crane's book, The Red Badge of Courage, which he published in 1895. Crane had never been in a war, but he wanted to describe the experience of battle, how it felt, the fear. And he did research on this. And he was actually lauded by soldiers who served in the Civil War for capturing that, capturing the psychological aspects, the interior aspects of it. Another person who was famous for this was Henry James. He's a novelist, brother of William James, the philosopher, who was famous for the subjectivity, going into the subjectivity of his characters. He wrote a famous novella in the 1898 called The Turn of the Screw, which was a ghost story. And again, focusing on the psychological subjective aspects rather than, and that's I guess the shtick of the story is it real or not? But it's not focusing on that. It's focusing on the subconscious. Another aspect of this is of writing in the late 19th century, early 20th century is increased regionalism. This is the idea that you're going to have writers like, well, the first one to do this is Mark Twain, right? He picks up on Southern dialects and puts them into his, Huck Finn novels, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. I believe it was Hemingway who famously said this was the first truly American novel. So the idea of capturing a national voice that wasn't, dictated by European literary standards. He also, by the way, became a bitter critic at the end of his life. But you also have this happening across not just literature, but other types of art forms. In novels, not just him, but people like Louisa May Alcott, who wrote about Little Women, girls in New England. Willa Cather, who writes a series of novels before World War I, sometimes called the Prairie Trilogy, about Midwestern life. I'm sure a lot of her stories are set in Nebraska. And even in architecture, there emerges a school of architecture called the Prairie School, which Frank Lloyd Wright, this is supposed to be, again, a particular style of architecture associated with the Midwest. Becomes a peculiarly American style of architecture. There's even in symphonic music, classical music, a New England school of composers in the 19th century who, again, are all from Boston. So you have this move that trying to define what America is, which is kind of tied to this regionalism, trying to find a national, quote unquote, national voice. Despite all this, you still have an international connection. A lot of what modernity does come from Europe as a self-conscious set of ideas. There are things, for example, you have painters by the end of the 19th century turning against the Impressionism of the late 19th century. What Impressionism is, this is sort of instead of depicting the natural landscape in its exact form, you paint it as if it's sort of a subjective impression of what it looks like. You know what I'm talking about. People like Monet and Vincent van Gogh, people like that. You have people turning against this in the United States, beginning to paint not just more realistic depictions. You do have some of that, but particularly choice of subjects. You'll have self-consciously modern subjects like urban landscapes, as opposed to rural landscape painting. And so they begin to invent their own form of realism. A group of New York artists who was called the Ashcan School because of their choice of subject matter, which involved the gritty everyday life of city dwellers. And they gave themselves this name, by the way, Ashcan. It was a joke because one of their critics had complained their paintings contained too many pictures of ash cans. And they were sort of criticizing that and making fun of it, and making fun of the whole idea of artistic schools. They were kind of loosely associated with one another. But a lot of these people participated in one of the most controversial events in American art history, the Armory Show of 1913, which was housed in a National Guard building in New York. And that show introduced America to modern art, including experiments with things like cubism, which is you have art characterized by abstract geometric forms, But a lot of that stuff was already appearing in Europe, is my point, to go back to the transatlantic connections. And you're going to have a lot of connections in the art world, literature and otherwise, with Europe. Stephen Crane was very popular in England. He was friends with Joseph Conrad, the novelist. Henry James, the novelist himself, actually lived in England from the 1870s onward, never came back. He's an American. And there were simultaneous movements in Europe. For example, the 1913 Armory Show, which was shocking, by the way, partly because it was self-consciously attacking older standards of art, what art was, of what beauty was. And that's why it was one of the reasons it was shocking. The same year that happened, in 1913, a Russian composer put on a ballet in Paris called The Rite of Spring, Igor Stravinsky. And I won't go into too many details and bore you with it, but for a variety of reasons, it so shocked and horrified the Parisian crowd that went to the ballet. There was a riot. People were throwing chairs and stuff at this ballet. And in fact, the event itself became a sort of celebrated event because of this, just like the Armory Show. And one more person to mention is you did have Americans participating in European art. I'll mention one in particular. Albert Bloch was a painter. I mentioned him. He was born in St. Louis. He was part of the Blue Rider group, which is also one of these self-consciously more abstract, more self-consciously modern painters who you can find, by the way, a lot of his works on display at the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, because he was from St. Louis. He went to Europe, came back. He taught for many years to the end of his life. He died in 1970. He taught at the University of Kansas, taught art there, but he published several paintings, part of this Blue Rider group, which you'll learn about and we'll just have a discussion. So you have these transatlantic connections at the same time. The United States is trying to, self-consciously, create a modern culture for itself. Just a few images here. This is the picture of the first page of The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, which was published serially. Back in those days, it was fairly common to publish novels in magazines as a serial. Like you'd write one part one week, then the next week, hook you, kind of like a Netflix series or something like that. And here we have an example of Frank Lloyd Wright's Robie House, 1909. Again, the prairie style of architecture. Again, it's different. I'm not sure why it's particularly Midwestern, but apparently it is. But again, you have that style. You can find homes like that, of course, around this area in Johnson County and the surrounding areas. This is a painting. I forgot to mention John Singer Sargent, talking about realism. This is John Singer Sargent was, again, a Bostonian, one of the great portrait painters of the age. You can also find some of his on display at the Nelson Atkins Museum. This painting here from 1897, depicting good middle-class people in their fine clothes. I love portrait painting. If you love portraiture, he's wonderful. If you're into his literature, but again, part of that milieu of late 19th century, made his name in Europe as well. This is Everett Shin's Fifth Avenue, one of these Ashcan school types. As you can kind of see, this is Fifth Avenue in New York. Still kind of impressionistic in terms of its style, but it's depicting, of course, with people walking down the street in the rain. So gritty everyday life subjects. You can see his name down there. And you can see how this changes, becomes more self-consciously modern in these paintings. This is a famous one of these first American modernists in terms of painting, Max Weber, the Chinese restaurant, which, again, lots of abstract geometric shapes, kind of cubist in nature. Again, intentionally sort of, breaking with past standards, right? That comes to the fore there. And then finally, there are changes, big changes in religion, which I have to talk about at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. One of the most important things that happens is at least in the Protestant world especially, but this gets into other places, is the modernist sort of debate, the modernist versus fundamentalist debate. And what happens is in the 19th century, critical biblical scholarship, which again, it begins in Germany, where the modern university begins. They begin treating the biblical texts like they would anything else, again, using that sort of more scientific approach to the Bible, treating it for merely a collection of human documents. And you begin to have, seriously critical, skeptical books being published. I won't go through all this. In Europe first, this begins to sort of undermine, especially in Protestant countries, among elites anyway, begins to sort of chip away at their faith in the truth of the Bible. On the other hand, you're going to have other parts of the various Protestant churches try to embrace certain liberal forms of Christianity, embrace some of these methods, but still retain some residual belief in Protestant Christianity, and this so-called, it's sometimes called the higher criticism, this strand of biblical scholarship. It undermines especially a literal reading of the Bible among the intellectual classes in Europe in the 19th century. And it's a challenge. And so what's going to happen is you're going to have, and especially, and this is a difference because there will be a modernist challenge within Catholicism. It's a little different there because Catholics have an authority which can definitively interpret the Bible. But in the Protestant world, you don't have this. So this is a much stronger challenge to this in a lot of ways. And the more evangelical strains of Protestantism, especially in Britain and America, had for a long time encouraged a literal reading of the Bible, especially the origins of the earth. And so, again, with the rise of Darwinism and stuff like this, is a challenge to them. And so you're going to have debates about the nature of the Bible lead to dispute between more liberal Protestants who want to take some of this into their theology and more conservative ones. And in America, a group of ministers held a series of conferences at Niagara Falls in the 1870s, 1880s, and they crafted what's called the Niagara Creed, reaffirming the literal truth of the Bible and the certainty of damnation for those not born again in Christ. And so you have increasingly this renewed emphasis on the literal reading of Scripture, and the re-emphasizing of traditional Protestant notions of theology. And by the early 20th century, these Protestants, these conservative Protestants, come to be known as fundamentalists, and they get this name not because that name tends to be used pejoratively today. It's not really what it meant back then. A group of conservative Protestant scholars issued a manifesto in several volumes from 1909, 1910 to 1915 called the Fundamentals, declaring what they thought the basic elements of Christianity were and attacking liberal forms of Christianity. And so you're going to have, this divide between, the liberal, we'll get to the social gospel in a second, liberal theological branches of Protestant Christianity and the more conservative ones. The more conservative ones still continue an earlier tradition of revivalist meetings. And people like Dwight Moody and then Billy Sunday are popular preachers. And he actually will, it's weird, it's kind of strange to describe all this, but Billy Sunday is kind of a popular figure in the 19th century. He sort of is a figure for this, masculine form of Protestant Christianity. But also in a weird way, both he and some of his confreres, they both adapt. They don't adapt the content of their faith, they adapt techniques of how to sort of spread the faith. He's a very commanding presence on stage. You'll get in the early 20th century the invention of radio. Preachers who do this on radio are fiery speakers, attracts people. And he, by the way, was also a baseball player before he became a preacher. And he makes use of, and other people do, of mass marketing techniques, which are pioneered by modern advertisers. Providing what amounts to mass entertainments for people. So it's not really true that fundamentalism or these more conservative Protestants, if you want to use that term, they're both adapting in a way to these challenges. As do the more liberal branch tend to identify with the social gospel movement. I mentioned that before. I'll come back to this in a moment because they're actually associated with, among other things, the eugenics movement, if you can imagine. One of these challenges they're faced, by the way, is our immigrant faiths. We mentioned this before. One of the challenges, of course, is immigrants from Europe who are Catholic, Jewish. They of course, themselves, the immigrants, face the challenge of trying to assimilate or not into the wider dominant culture. There'll actually be a modernist movement in the Catholic Church as well. It gets condemned by the Pope in the early 20th century. But you'll have that, being a tension, huge tension, obviously, that'll play itself out, especially the immigrant part of it when you get in the 1920s. You'll also have new movements, and one new movement is the Pentecostal movement. This is a revival that begins. It depends on where you're talking about. It really begins in Kansas, actually, other places. But it's a movement. It's sort of like the evangelical revivals of an earlier period, but it's characterized very particularly by ecstatic spiritual experiences accompanied by miracles, dramatic worship services, speaking in tongues, but also, especially, at least in its early phases, by something that's very unique, and that's interracial mixing. The Pentecostal movement usually is dated beginning, at least officially, if you want to put it that way, in 1906 in Los Angeles, in the Azusa Street mission on Azusa Street, I guess. And I don't have the gentleman's name down here, but it was an African-American minister who had, at least for the first several years, eventually they closed up shop, but this sort of street mission, which had a multi-ethnic congregation, Black, Hispanic, white. And its participants were criticized by both the secular media and more conservative Christian theologians for behavior that was considered to be unorthodox, maybe even outrageous. But it caught fire, and in fact, Pentecostalism is going to be, I believe it's the fastest growing religious movement in the world today. It's sort of a world movement now. But it began among immigrants and people of multi-ethnic persuasions in Los Angeles, of all places. Imagine. And finally, again, and part of the reason I'm emphasizing this modern religious landscape is to emphasize that the divisions are going to open up, especially after World War I. I have to mention the social gospel, partly because, and eugenics, partly because there was crossover between supporters of eugenics and not just even the social gospel types themselves. A lot of the main figures did support eugenics. According to Christine Rosen, wrote a very fine book years ago called Preaching Eugenics. It's about the support for eugenics by religious institutions in the early 20th century. Pretty much every major religious body in the United States, in one form or another, some more than others, basically gave their imprimatur in some ways to things like, raising healthier families, raising fitter families, trying to do stuff like this. The only two bodies that were actually, the only two religious organizations, I should say, that were opposed to this on principle and did for the most part were, one, the fundamentalists. And if you wonder why, it's because you can't justify eugenics on a literal reading of the Bible. You can't do it. Other were the Roman Catholics. Catholics for a slightly different reason, not necessarily because of the literal reading of Genesis, because of their ideas of natural law. They have essentially a medieval idea of natural law, which you can't do certain things like that. You can't kill people. You can't do evil that good would come of it, is the way you put it. And there were a couple of Catholic priests who toyed with it, but they were condemned. Rome had nothing to do with this, trust me. But every other branch of Christianity had some sort of form of support of it, and even certain Jewish thinkers supported it. And one of the things that's notable about this is that all the churches that were respectable religious bodies, the older religious denominations, Episcopalians, Presbyterians. And by respectable, you should read class. All the more upper middle class types did it. But Catholics were immigrants, they were poor, less socially elevated. Same thing with the fundamentalists, who tended to be, again, some of them were middle class. They attracted, they had, they were lower on the social scale. Class plays into this as well. But it's very true that the social gospel types were kind of that one, the whole progressive mindset, which again, I'm not going to blame progressivism as a whole, because the entire country tended to think in similar terms. But it's true, the progressive movement, fed into things like eugenics. There's no question about it. And so that's, again, this division between, scientific knowledge and faith and all this stuff, social tensions, all opening up before the war, but then opening up after that as well, as we'll get to next time. And then finally, this is an image from 1907. That's the Azusa Street mission, Apostolic Faith Gospel Mission is what the title was. They even had their own little newspaper, which I think was called Apostolic Faith. And you can actually find it on the internet. It's kind of interesting, them talking about their own revival meetings and stuff. This is just an image of Christian missions in Japan. Again, you can see the missionaries there. It's a native Japanese and a white guy, a white American missionary in the center. And there's an image of Billy Sunday with his Bible, giving a sermon, and got his fist raised. Very masculine, very manly. Again, fiery speaker though. Some of these preachers can really get people, if you listen to them, it can be engaging. We don't appreciate oratory anymore because of our technological, we listen to things on our headphones, but a good speaker can be very, very powerful. And it includes not just religion, but preachers like this were very, very good at it. Let me see here. And then this is just a picture of the fundamentals. It was volume 1 from 1910, and what they looked like. They were issued. And again, I should mention, by the way, the people who wrote this were actual scholars. They were not, again, fundamentalism. The term fundamentalism has become associated, I think, with both intellectual but also class contempt. Now, you probably get that out of your minds for the most part. It was originally the work of people who were very educated and everything. So, and that is all. So, America becoming a modern country and engaging in debates about the modern world, differences about how to respond to it, which will come to the surface in the 1920s. A lot of tensions following World War I, and we'll get submerged by World War II, and then the post-war period will emerge again, as you'll see in the 1960s, all reflecting this need to deal with the modern world and with the ideas of modernity. So that's what we'll talk about in discussion for next time. Hope this guy was helpful for you guys. We'll see you guys and talk to you soon.